Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and guests, as you watch this presentation, I'm on a cruise ship between Brisbane and Darwin heading for Singapore. I mention this not to boast, although I have to say it is a lot of fun, but to tell you that what I'm doing is taking part in one of the fastest growing tourism sectors in the world, cruising. The idea of ships being used for what we call leisure travel, cruising, was first introduced in 1844 by the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, later known, of course, as P&O. Oh, ships had long carried passengers, but it was in 1844 that P&O started carrying passengers with specific leisure destination stops in Gibraltar, and then Malta, and then Athens, and then home again. And so because of that, 1844 is considered the beginning of a new industry. But it's a German ship which is in fact credited with being the first luxury cruise liner. And let's take a look at it. The Princesses Victoria Louise. She was completed in 1900 and set the bar for later ocean liners and cruise ships in carrying passengers to their destinations. Now, the Princess's reign actually only lasted a short time. She ran aground in 1906, but in that time, her design was one that hadn't been seen before in the shipping or cruising industries. She was all white, catering to the higher class, modelled after first-rate yachts, fitted with 120 first-class cabins for passengers, along with a few amenities to make their voyage a more pleasurable one would be a good way of putting it. But I have to say, the industry quickly learned there were flaws in using cruise ships or ocean liners as cruise ships. Now, we use the terms almost interchangeably, cruise liner, ocean liner, but they are in fact different. Ocean liners were built with a particular purpose, to transport passengers from one place to another, but pretty much as, if you like, human cargo. One of the most famous of those was the Titanic, and let's take a look at her. The Titanic, for example, had the majority of passengers, and an even bigger majority of those who died on the maiden voyage, second or third class passengers. The third class passengers, in fact, were known as steerage. They were down the bottom down here. They were virtually cargo. Now, the Titanic was, in many ways, both fish and fowl. She carried those thousands of immigrants searching for a new life in the United States, but she also catered to some of the wealthiest people in astounding luxury. So, let's talk about those ships. Transportation was the ocean liners' main objective for their passengers, but liners had started receiving some stiff competition from cruise ships, which offered greater amenities and more pleasurable travel for those who wanted to explore to new places, but then come back home again at the end of it. So in order to compete, ocean liners started adding amenities like fine dining and luxury services and state-of-the-art staterooms. In fact, the Titanic had started to spread all of those amenities not just to the first-class passengers, but to everybody. There were cooks on board for the steerage passengers for the first time. That meant that steerage passengers didn't need to bring and prepare their own food, and that was quite a change. But liners like the Titanic were still based on carrying the greatest number of passengers, and they were also built to withstand the weather of all routes. Now, that meant enclosed decks, so passengers couldn't enjoy the luxury of balmy tropical climates. Over time, cruise liners and ocean liners have seen a blurring in their once glaring differences, but there are still some differences remain. The speed of the engines, the availability of open decks for passengers. Let's take a look at the difference between the two types of ship. A good way to do that is to consider these stamps from Gibraltar in 2007. At the top, you can see the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. These are obviously liners. They're built for speed and to carve through all seas with their classic lines, sleek and streamlined. They also use far more steel than cruise liners, which tend to have a lot more glass and aluminium and be more boxy, like the Oceana, shown here in the bottom left. Interestingly, the fourth ship here on the bottom right is the Oriana. She was launched in 1995 as a cruise ship, but she was designed and equipped to operate world voyages rather than being restricted mostly to the Med or the Caribbean, which is why she still has those classic lines, but has the comfort and ambience of traditional ocean liners as well. So those are the differences, if you like, between the two ships, which brings us to the future, the next generation of ships. They fall largely into one of two categories, either the mega or the niche. One strategy are the mega ships, like the Allure of the Seas. Let's take a look at her, shall we? It's an Oasis class ship. Now, The ship I'm currently cruising on is the Ovation of the Seas, a Quantum class. It's far and away the biggest ship that we've ever sailed on, with 4,200 passengers. That's about double the size of most cruise ships servicing Australia. But the largest existing ships are the Oasis class, like the Allure pictured here. It carries even more passengers, 5,500 or so, and is 360 metres long. So let's compare her to the Legend of the Seas, which is a ship from the same company, the Royal Caribbean. Now, the Legend of the Seas is the largest ship capable of using Brisbane's Hamilton Portside Cruise facility. It's 260 metres long, so that means it's got a clearance of just a few metres as it turns around in the river at that point. The Allure, on the other hand, just wouldn't have a hope of being able to turn around in the river. Even the Ovation at 348 metres long had to dock much further downstream at Fisherman's Island when we sailed into Brisbane on Wednesday. So you can see that the biggest ships afloat are huge. Now, these vessels can carry up to 6,000 passengers and 3,500 crew. When you think about it, that's bigger than some small towns I've lived in. They're based on what economists call economies of scale. More passengers per voyage, reducing the cost per passenger and therefore making for more profitable journeys. But there are some alternatives too. Let's take a look at a couple of those. One is the Windsurf. Now, this is a high-tech sailing ship that's now taking passengers on specialty cruises around the world. We've spotted her in the Caribbean, off the Costa del Sol, where this picture was taken. I've even heard of her sailing down this way. With her triangular self-furling sails set to assist her diesel engines, this little beauty carries just 310 passengers. That's less than 10% of the megaships, but she scoots along at about 15 knots wind assisted, which is pretty good. It's one of a new class of green cruise ships designed to minimise the environmental footprint of sailing. Another one is the Scenic Eclipse. It's due to take its first passengers next year. As you can see, it's an interesting design, sort of like a sharpened teardrop. She's only going to have 114 suites. Each has floor-to-ceiling glass walls and separate balconies. There are 2 helicopters on board. There's even a submarine and a zero emissions policy for wastewater and stuff like that. Now, the ship's not going to be cheap. Maiden voyage specials, I noted, start at $1,500 per day per passenger and up, and that's on a special. But I have to say there is actually a market for this sort of ship. So what will the industry do as it transitions to new technologies becoming more commonplace? What other security features are going to have to be developed and launched on cruise ships? What challenges and changes are coming that we can't even imagine yet? Well, I, for one, don't know. All I can say is that time will tell, and I'm looking forward to finding out. Mr. Toastmaster.